The section of the German ideology on Feuerbach was one of the most central of Marx's works. It was a tremendous achievement in view of the low level of socialist writing and thought prevalent at the time. Marx never subsequently stated his materialist conception of history at such length and in detail. It remains a masterpiece today for the cogency and clarity of its presentation. Yet it remained unknown for almost a century. From the beginning of 1846, Marx and Engels made great efforts to find a publisher for the German ideology. Wedemeyer and Hess conducted lengthy negotiations with Rempel and Meyer, two Westphalian businessmen who sympathized with true socialism and had agreed to put up the necessary money. At least 6 other prospective publishers were approached. The manuscript was sent to Cologne and even split up into sections to be published separately. The authors continued their efforts up till the end of 1847, but only the short review of Grind was ever published. This failure was due to the strict censorship regulations and the serious financial risks incurred in publishing radical works, though Marx considered that the refusals were motivated by the publisher's opposition to his ideas. Thus, as Marx wrote later, we abandoned the manuscript to the gnawing of the mice all the more willingly as we had achieved our main purpose, self-clarification. And, in fact, the manuscript as it survives does bear considerable traces of mice's teeth. Marx nevertheless continued to work frantically on his economics and politics. His publisher Lesk had threatened to cancel the contract. Marx duly promised the first volume by the end of November. But he was distracted by his polemic with Proudhon. Lesk accordingly cancelled the contract in February 1847, though he was still trying to recover his advance in 1871. Whiteland G. and Proudhon. With the German ideology, Marx and Engels clarified their fundamental differences with the young Hegelians and, more importantly, with contemporary German socialists. They now turned their attention to impress their newly acquired insights on the very varied existing left-wing groups, and to win over to our convictions the European proletariat in general and the German proletariat in particular. Brussels was an ideal vantage point from which to build up contacts among German socialists, for it was in the middle of a triangle formed by Paris and London, where the largest colonies of expatriate German workers had congregated, and Cologne, capital of the Rhineland, the German province by far the most receptive to communist ideas. In Brussels, a colony of gifted German exiles soon began to form around Marx. He had been accompanied on his journey from Paris by Heinrich Burgers, a young journalist who had contributed to the Rheinische Zeitung and become a communist in Paris. The morning after their arrival, Marx insisted that they call on the poet Ferdinand Freiligrath, who had been attacked by the Rheinische Zeitung for subservience to the Prussian government, which had nonetheless later exiled him for his radical writings. Their meeting was a cordial one in which Freiligrath found Marx an interesting fellow, agreeable and unpretentious. Through Freiligrath and the German solicitor Karl Marx, Marx met the leading Belgian Democrats, in particular the lawyer Ayushien Jatrand, and the leader of the Polish exiles Lelowel, and also Philippe Gigot, a young Belgian paleographist in the Ministry of the Interior. Among the Germans who were closely connected with Marx were Sebastian Seiler, a former Swiss contributor to the Rheinische Zeitung who ran a left-orientated news agency in Brussels, Karl Heinzen, a radical journalist then in the insurance business, Hermann Krieg, a journalist and disciple of Weitling, Wilhelm Wolff, who had arrived unheralded on the Marx's doorstep in 1846 straight from Silesia, where he had escaped from arrest for communist propaganda among the peasantry, and George Worth, a representative for a German commercial firm who, though still in his early 20s, had already made a reputation as a poet. Jenny's unstable but likable brother, Edgar, who had a temporary job in Seiler's agency, also formed part of the group. Marx was also visited by Stefan Born, a young typesetter who was to play a central role in the 1848 revolution. After a brief stay in the Bois Savage guest house, for economy reasons, he told Wedemeyer, the Marx family moved in October 1846 to Ixelles, a southern suburb of Brussels. Here, Marx's first son, the ill-fated Edgar, was born. Marx's financial situation was becoming very difficult, and he was forced to write begging letters to Herweg and Annenkov. He managed to get a loan from Burgers in Cologne and also from his brother-in-law, but the situation only improved when in early 1848 his mother granted him a sizable advance on his inheritance. Jenny was glad of the opportunities afforded by Brussels to extend her horizons beyond the household. In Germany, she wrote to Marx at the beginning of their stay, "A child is still a very great honor. The cooking pot and needle still bring respect, and moreover one still has the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled in return for all the days spent washing, sewing, and minding the children." But when these old things no longer count as duties and honors and so on, when people progress so far that they even consider such old expressions to be obsolete, from then on one feels no more impulse to the small duties of life. One wants to enjoy, become active and experience in oneself the happiness of mankind. In his memoirs written some 50 years later, Stephen Born left the following account of his visit to Marx in late 1847. I found him in a very simple, I might almost say poor little dwelling in a suburb of Brussels. He received me in a friendly fashion, asking me about the success of my propaganda trip, and complimented me on my pamphlet against Heinzen. His wife joined him in this and gave me a friendly welcome. I have seldom known so happy a marriage in which joy and suffering, the latter in most abundant measure, were shared and all sorrow overcome in the consciousness of full and mutual dependency. Moreover, I have seldom known a woman who in outward appearance as well as in spirit was so well balanced and so immediately captivating as Mrs. Marx. She was fair-haired, and the children, who were then still young, had their father's dark hair and eyes. Marx's mother, who lived in Trier, contributed to the expenses of the household, though the writer's pen no doubt had to find the greater part. After his stay in Brussels, Marx made very few close friendships. Most of those he made or strengthened in Brussels remained so for life. Even before the German ideology was finished, Marx had started to establish a communist correspondence committee in which Engels and Gigot were to take the most active part. This committee was the embryo of all the subsequent communist internationals. It was designed as an instrument to harmonize and coordinate communist theory and practice in the European capitals. Marx described the aim as providing both a discussion of scientific questions and a critical appraisal of popular writings and socialist propaganda that can be conducted in Germany by these means. But the main aim of our correspondence will be to put German socialists in touch with English and French socialists, to keep foreigners informed of the socialist movements that will develop in Germany, and to inform the Germans in Germany of the progress of socialism in France and England. In this way, differences of opinion will be brought to light, and we shall obtain an exchange of ideas and impartial criticism. This correspondence committee, and the subsequent Communist League which followed it, were Marx's first ventures into practical politics. The foundation of the committee was to account for two controversies that raised questions central to the communist movement of that time. The first, with Weitling, carried into practical politics the polemic against true socialism and the German ideology. The second, with Proudhon, continued for the best part of the century, Proudhon's followers being particularly active in the First International. Weitling was the illegitimate son of a French officer and a German laundrywoman, and earned his living as an itinerant tailor while absorbing the writings of the French socialists. His first book, Mankind as It Is and As It Ought to Be, had been written in 1838 at the request of the League of the Just in Paris, and he had been very effective in his propaganda in Switzerland, where his imprisonment had earned him the additional distinction of a martyr's halo. Thus, he was widely welcomed on his arrival in London in 1844. During 1845, however, his preacher's style, the quasi-religious terms in which he expounded his ideas, his demands for immediate revolution, his proposals for a dictatorship à la Babeuf, and the marked psychological deterioration caused by his imprisonment, all these factors ended by alienating the majority of the London German communists, who felt his approach to be impractical and unrealistic. On his way back to the continent in early 1846, Weitling stopped in Brussels, and the newly founded Correspondence Committee invited him to a discussion in Marx's house. Among those present were Engels, Gigot, Edgar von Westphalen, Weidmeyer, Seiler, a journalist Heilberg, and a visitor by special invitation, Paul Anenkov, a well-to-do Russian tourist whom Marx had known in Paris. Weitling struck him as a handsome fair-haired young man in a coat of elegant cut, a coquettishly trimmed small beard, someone more like a commercial traveler than the stern, embittered worker that I had expected to meet. Anenkov continued, we introduced ourselves to each other casually with a touch of elaborate courtesy on Weitling's side, however, and took our places at the small green table. Marx sat at one end of it with a pencil in his hand and his leonine head bent over a sheet of paper, while Engels, his inseparable fellow worker and comrade in propaganda, tall and erect and as dignified and serious as an Englishman, made the opening speech. He spoke of the necessity for people who have devoted themselves to transforming labor, to explain their views to one another and agree on a single common doctrine that could be a banner for all their followers who lacked the time and opportunity to study theory. Engels had not finished his speech when Marx raised his head, turned to Weitling and said, "Tell us, Weitling, you who have made such a noise in Germany with your preaching, on what grounds do you justify your activity and what do you intend to base it on in the future?" I remember quite well the form of the blunt question, because it was the beginning of a heated discussion, which, as we shall see, was very brief. Weitling apparently wanted to keep the conference within the bounds of commonplace liberal talk. With a serious, somewhat worried face, he started to explain that his aim was not to create new economic theories but to adopt those that were most appropriate, as experience in France had shown, to open the eyes of the workers to the horrors of their condition and all the injustices which it had become the motto of the rulers and societies to inflict on them, and to teach them never more to believe any promises of the latter, but to rely only upon themselves, and to organize in democratic and communist associations. He spoke for a long time, but to my astonishment and in contrast to Engels confusedly and not too well from the literary point of view, often repeating and correcting himself and arriving with difficulty at his conclusions, which either came too late or preceded his propositions. He now had quite different listeners from those who generally surrounded him at his work or read his newspaper and pamphlets on the contemporary economic system. He therefore lost his ease of thought and speech. Weitling would probably have gone on talking had not Marx checked him with an angry frown and started his reply. Marx's sarcastic speech boiled down to this: to rouse the population without giving them any firm, well-thought-out reasons for their activity would be simply to deceive them. The raising of fantastic hopes just spoken of, Marx continued, led only to the final ruin and not to the saving of the sufferers. To call to the workers without any strictly scientific ideas or constructive doctrine, especially in Germany, was equivalent to vain dishonest play at preaching which assumed on the one side an inspired prophet and on the other only gaping asses. Weitling's pale cheeks colored and he regained his liveliness and ease of speech. In a voice trembling with emotion, he started trying to prove that a man who had rallied hundreds of people under the same banner in the name of justice, solidarity and mutual brotherly assistance could not be called completely vain and useless. Weitling consoled himself for the evening's attacks by remembering the hundreds of letters and declarations of gratitude that he had received from all parts of his native land, and by the thought that his modest spadework was perhaps of greater weight for the common cause than criticism and armchair analysis of doctrines far from the world of the suffering and afflicted people. On hearing these last words, Marx finally lost control of himself and thumped so hard with his fist on the table that the lamp on it rung and shook. He jumped up saying, "Ignorance never yet helped anybody." We followed his example and left the table. The sitting ended, and as Marx paced up and down the room, extraordinarily irritated and angry, I hurriedly took leave of him and his interlocutors and went home, amazed at all I had seen and heard. The day after this discussion, Weitling wrote to Hess that Marx had insisted on vetting party members, that for Marx the question of financial resources was all important. Weitling had the impression that Marx wished to exclude him from the Westphalian publishing project. There was to be no propaganda based on emotional appeals, and lastly, there can be no talk at present of achieving communism. The bourgeoisie must first come to the helm. Weitling continued, I see in Marx's head only a good encyclopedia, but no genius. He owes his influence to other people. Rich men back him in journalism. That's all. Of this was not the end of all contact between Weitling and Marx. For the next few weeks Weitling continued to accept a midday meal from Marx. But Marx went on with his campaign by issuing a circular against I. Lerman-Krieg, a young Westphalian journalist who had been a member of the Brussels group before going to London and finally emigrating to America, where he published a weekly entitled Volksstreben. Krieg's views were much more representative of true socialism than Weitling's, and this lengthy circular condemned Krieg's ideas as not communism. They were childish and pompous and imaginary and sentimental exaltation that compromised the communist movement in America and demoralized the workers. There followed sections in which derision was poured on Krieg's metaphysical and religious phraseology, his use of the word love 35 times in a single article, and his naive scheme of dividing up the soil of America equally between all citizens, which aimed at turning all men into owners of private property. Weitling was the only member of the Correspondence Committee who voted against the circular. He left Brussels immediately for Luxembourg and then some months later moved to W. York on Krieg's invitation. The circular aroused a considerable volume of protest. Hess wrote to Marx about Weitling, "You have made him quite crazy, and don't be surprised. I want to have nothing more to do with the whole business. It's enough to make one sick." And a week later he wrote that he himself wished to have nothing more to do with your party. London communists also reacted strongly against the circular. This attack on Krieg was apparently only one of many such pamphlets, for Marx wrote later, "We published at the same time a series of pamphlets, partly printed, partly lithographed, in which we subjected to a merciless criticism the mixture of French-English socialism or communism and German philosophy, which at the time constituted the secret doctrine of the League." We established in its place the scientific understanding of the economic structure of bourgeois society as the only tenable theoretical foundation. We also explained in popular form that our task was not the fulfillment of some utopian system, but the conscious participation in the historical process of social revolution that was taking place before our eyes. At the same time, Marx tried to forge links with Paris, where the most influential socialist was Proudhon. His position as a French thinker was peculiar in that he shared the atheistic approach to communism of the German young Hegelians and rejected the patriotic Jacobinism that made Paris so impenetrable to German ideas. In early Mai 1846, Marx wrote to Proudhon describing the aims of the Correspondence Committee and inviting him to act as its Paris correspondent, since as far as France is concerned we can find no better correspondent than Yourself P. In a postscript, Marx warned Proudhon against Gratien, whom he described as a charlatan, who misuses his acquaintances. Gigot and Engels also added postscripts saying how pleased they would be if Proudhon could accept the invitation. Proudhon's reply cannot have pleased Marx. He was willing to participate in Marx's project, but he had several reservations. Let us together seek, if you wish, the law of society, the manner in which these laws are realized, the process by which we shall succeed in discovering them. But, for God's sake, after having demolished all the a priori dogmatisms, do not let us in our turn dream of indoctrinating the people. I applaud with all my heart your thought of inviting all shades of opinion. Let us carry on a good and loyal polemic. Let us give the world the example of an informed and far-sighted tolerance. But let us not simply because we are at the head of a movement make ourselves the leaders of a new intolerance. Let us not pose as the apostles of a new religion, even if it be the religion of logic, the religion of reason. Let us gather together and encourage all dissent. Let us outlaw all exclusiveness, all mysticism. Let us never regard a question as exhausted, and when we have used our last argument, let us, if necessary, begin again with eloquence and irony. On these conditions, I will gladly enter into your association. Otherwise no, Proudhon continued by saying that he was not in favor of immediate revolutionary action and preferred to burn property by a slow fire, rather than give it new strength by making a St. Bartholomew's Night of the property owners. There followed an ironical paragraph. This, my dear philosopher, is where I am at the moment, unless, of course, I am mistaken and the occasion arises to receive a caning from you, to which I subject myself with good grace while waiting for my revenge. Proudhon finished by excusing Grill on the grounds that he had been obliged to exploit modern ideas in order to earn money for his family. He added, moreover, that it was at GRTLN's suggestion that he was hoping to insert a mention of Marx's works in his next book, The System of Economic Contradictions, subtitled The Philosophy of Poverty. Marx apparently made no reply to Proudhon's letter except in the form of his furious attack on Proudhon's book published a year later under the title of The Poverty of Philosophy. In his reply, Marx accepted Proudhon's facetious invitation to administer the cane with a vengeance. Proudhon's book was a large sprawling 2-volume work which bore the motto Destroy-me id cabo, though there was much more of the former than the latter. With great vigor Proudhon attacked religion, academic economics and communism, but did not provide any very clear solutions. The book's ideas were very popular among French workers, and in Germany 3 separate translations were arranged and 2 published in 1847, one being by Grin, whose ideas Engels had spent such a long time combating in Paris. Marx did not obtain Proudhon's book until Christmas 1846 and immediately wrote his impression of it in a long letter to Annenkov, in which he clearly and succinctly applied to Proudhon's ideas his own materialist conception of history. The center of Marx's criticism was that Proudhon did not grasp the historical development of humanity and thus had recourse to eternal concepts such as reason and justice. Marx wrote, "What is society? Whatever its form may be. The product of men's reciprocal action. Are men free to choose this or that form of society for themselves? By no means. Assume a particular state of development in the productive forces of man and you will get a particular form of commerce and consumption. Assume particular stages of development in production, commerce and consumption and you will have a corresponding social constitution, a corresponding organization of the family, of orders or of classes, in a word, a corresponding civil society. Assume a particular civil society and you will get particular political conditions which are only the official expression of civil society." Proudhon will never understand this because he thinks he is doing something great by appealing from the state to society, that is to say, from the official synopsis of society to official society. It is superfluous to add that men are not free to choose their productive forces, which are the basis of all their history, for every productive force is an acquired force, the product of former activity. A coherence arises in human history, a history of humanity takes shape, which is all the more a history of humanity as the productive forces of man and therefore his social relations have been more developed. Hence it necessarily follows that the social history of men is never anything but the history of their individual development, whether they are conscious of it or not. Their material relations are the basis of all their relations. These material relations are only the necessary forms in which their material and individual activity is realized. Marx did, however, grant that Proudhon, by trying to mediate between bourgeois economics and socialist ideas, had the merit of being the scientific interpreter of the French petty bourgeoisie, a genuine merit because the petty bourgeoisie will form an integral part of all the impending social revolutions. These criticisms were elaborated on in his two-part book, The Poverty of Philosophy. The first part dealt with the theory of value and the second began with an attack on Proudhon's method and ended with an important section on the working class movement. At the very outset, Marx criticized Proudhon's lack of a precise starting point for his analysis. Proudhon's dialectic merely consisted in the substitution for use value and exchange value and for supply and demand, of abstract and contradictory notions such as scarcity and abundance, utility and estimation, one producer and one consumer, both of them knights of free will. And Proudhon's purpose in this was to arrange for himself a means of introducing later on one of the elements he had set aside, the cost of production, as the synthesis of use value and exchange value. And it is thus that in his eyes the cost of production constitutes synthetic value or constituted value. By constituted value of a product, Proudhon meant the value which is constituted by the labor time incorporated in it. According to Marx, this doctrine was no invention of Proudhon's, as he claimed, but was clearly to be found in Ricardo, the difference between them being that Ricardo takes his starting point from present-day society to demonstrate to us how it constitutes value. Proudhon takes constituted value as his starting point to construct a new social world with the aid of this value. So far from one's being able to draw egalitarian consequences from this doctrine, it meant that wages always tended to a minimum. For Proudhon had confused the two measures, measure by the labor time needed for the production of a commodity and measure by the value of the labor. Any man's labor, he says, can buy the value it represents. Thus, according to him, a certain quantity of labor embodied in a product is equivalent to the worker's payment, that is, to the value of labor. It is the same reasoning that makes him confuse cost of production with wages. Thus, in measuring the value of commodities by labor, Proudhon vaguely glimpses the impossibility of excluding labor from this same measure, insofar as labor has a value, as labor is a commodity. He has a misgiving that it is turning the wage minimum into the natural and normal price of immediate labor, that it is accepting the existing state of society. So, to get away from this fatal consequence, he contradicts himself and asserts that labor is not a commodity, that it cannot have value. He forgets that he himself has taken the value of labor as a measure. Further, Proudhon set out to show that the labor time needed to create a product indicates its true proportional relation to needs, so that the things whose production costs the least time are the most immediately useful, and so on, step by step. But the same argument would show that the wide use of spirits, because of their low cost of production, is the most conclusive proof of their utility. It is telling the proletarian that potatoes are more wholesome for him than meat. It is accepting the present state of affairs. It is, in short, making an apology, with Proudhon, for a society without understanding it. For Marx, on the other hand, in a future society, in which class antagonism will have ceased, in which there will no longer be any classes, use will no longer be determined by the minimum time of production, but the time of production devoted to different articles will be determined by the degree of their social utility. Proudhon's proposals abstracted from differences in demand, competition, etc., and he was inevitably forced into a dilemma: either you want the genuine bartering process of past centuries with present-day means of production, in which case you are both reactionary and utopian, or you want progress without anarchy, in which case, in order to preserve the productive forces, you must abandon individual exchange. Anyway, Marx claimed, Proudhon was far from the first to think of reforming society by transforming all men into actual workers exchanging equal amounts of labor. To prove his point, he quoted at great length from the English economist Bray, views which he nevertheless rejected on the grounds that individual exchange corresponds to a definite mode of production which itself corresponds to class antagonism. There is thus no individual exchange without the antagonism of classes. Marx then finished the first half of the book with remarks on the impossibility of deducing the value of money from labor time, and on the way that Proudhon, in order to oppose the idea that labor produced a surplus, had to suppose existing social relations to be non-existent. In the second part of the book, Marx attacked Proudhon's desire to frighten the French by flinging quasi-Hegelian phrases at them, and his use of such pseudo-explanatory devices as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. He then accused Proudhon of seeing in actual relations nothing but the incarnation of principles, and continued in a well-known passage, social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production, and in changing their mode of production, in changing the way of earning their living, they change all their social relations. The handmill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist. According to Marx, in the eyes of classical economists, there are only two kinds of institutions, artificial and natural. The institutions of feudalism are artificial institutions, those of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions. But bourgeois doctrines were as relative as any other and were to be supplanted by proletarian economic doctrines. The theoreticians of such doctrines were, of course, nearly utopian in the beginning of the proletarian movement, but to the extent that history moves forward and with it the struggle of the proletariat assumes clearer outlines, they no longer need to seek solutions by drawing on their imagination, they have only to take note of what is happening before their eyes and to become its mouthpiece. So long as they look for knowledge by merely constructing systems, so long as they are at the beginning of the struggle, they see in poverty nothing but poverty without seeing in it the revolutionary, subversive aspect which will overthrow the old society. From this moment, knowledge, which is a product of historical process, will have associated itself consciously with it, cease to be doctrinaire and become revolutionary. Proudhon was also deficient in his account of the division of labor, which was not an economic category but a historical one. Competition, equally, was above all an 18th century product and no eternal category. And landed property was no independent relation, a category apart, no abstract and eternal idea. Finally, Marx rejected Proudhon's view that strikes for higher wages were useless as their success only entailed a corresponding increase in prices. He dealt with this view in the last pages of his book, which contained a sort of anarchist manifesto portraying the working class as essentially revolutionary. An oppressed class is the vital condition for every society founded on the antagonism of classes. The emancipation of the oppressed class thus implies necessarily the creation of a new society. For the oppressed class to be able to emancipate itself, it is necessary that the existing productive powers and social relations should no longer be capable of existing side by side. Of all the instruments of production, the greatest productive power is the revolutionary class itself. The organization of revolutionary elements as a class presupposes the existence of all the productive forces which could be brought to fruition within the framework of the old society. Does this mean that after the collapse of the old society there will be a new dominant class culminating in a new political power? No. The condition for the emancipation of the working class is the abolition of every class, just as the condition for the liberation of the third estate, of the bourgeois order, was the abolition of all estates and all orders. The working class, in the course of its development, will substitute for the old civil society an association which will exclude classes and their antagonism, and there will be no more political power as such, since political power is precisely the official expression of antagonism in civil society. Meanwhile, the antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie is a struggle of class against class, a struggle which, carried to its highest expression, is a total revolution. Indeed, is it at all surprising that a society founded on the opposition of classes should culminate in brutal contradiction, the shock of body against body, as its final denouement? Do not say that social movement excludes political movement. There is never a political movement which is not at the same time social. It is only in an order of things in which there are no more classes and class antagonisms that social evolutions will cease to be political revolutions. Till then, on the eve of every general restructuring of society, the last word of social science will always be, le combat ou la mort, la lutte sanguinaire ou l'unent. Se ainsi que la question est invinciblement pos poundi. George Sand. Marx's book contained the first published and systematic statement of the materialist conception of history, and he himself recommended it as an introduction to Capital. It also demonstrated Marx's great talent as a pamphleteer, though Proudhon's book was certainly an easy target. However, in spite of its having been published in both Brussels and Paris, the total edition of 800 copies made little impression on Marx's contemporaries, and he had to pay for the printing himself.
Proudhon called the book a tissue of abuse, falsification and plagiarism, and its author the tapeworm of socialism.
He carefully annotated his own copy of The Poverty of Philosophy and probably intended to reply, but was interrupted by family affairs and the 1848 revolution. Thus culminated the highly acrimonious debate between the two men. Proudhon was only one of several Paris socialists that the Brussels Correspondence Committee sought to recruit. The others, however, were not much more fruitful. There was a brief exchange of letters with Louis Blanc and Dr. Urebeck, who espoused a sort of peaceful communist humanism based on Cabot's ideas, served as a rallying point for what remained of the League of the Just. Having persuaded the Marx family to spend a fortnight with him at Ostend, Engels himself went to Paris in August 1846. In the regular letters he sent back to the Brussels Correspondence Committee, he reported on the progress of his propaganda among the German workers, which he directed particularly against Grin and the disciples of Proudhon. Among the main craft unions in Paris, the tailors were still subject to the effect of Weitling's emotionally based communist propaganda, though he himself had left the city. Engels therefore attempted to recruit the remnants of the League of the Just, mostly members of joiners' unions, and instill into them some definite form of communism. By October he could report back to Brussels that his new recruits had now accepted a definition of communism comprising a maintenance of the interests of the proletariat against those of the bourgeoisie, the abolition of private property, and, as a means, a violent democratic revolution. This ideological victory, however, was not of great moment for Engels. Continued in the same letter, the public in front of whom we played this face was composed of about 20 joiners. Apart from our meetings, they organized discussions with all sorts of people in the outer boulevards, and outside their working association, they do not form any real group degree. This letter showed Engels in a moment of uncharacteristic realism. In general, it is clear that Engels was over-optimistic about the success of his propaganda. At the end of October the police intervened to stop even what small-scale activity existed, and Engels thought it more prudent to turn his attention to the conquest of as many girls of as many different nationalities as possible before he left Paris. Correspondence with Germany was established on a fairly regular basis. There were periodic reports from Silesia inspired by Wilhelm Wolff, from Wuppertal where the painter Kotkin, a close friend of Hess, led a communist group, and from Kiel where George Weber, a doctor, led the movement. Marx, however, was impatient with Weidmeyer's failure in Westphalia to find a publisher for the German ideology, and relations became strained. The center of communist activity was still Cologne. Hess was there for the second half of 1846 and declared himself to some extent reconciled to the party. He recognized the necessity of basing communism on historical and economic presuppositions and was waiting with great interest for the appearance of Marx's book. His break with Marx did not become final until early 1848. But Marx's ideas seem to have had very little impact there, although the group there was organized by Roland Daniels, a close friend of Marx, with the support of Dester and Burgers, and was very active in local politics. The only letter that has survived from the Brussels communists to Germany is one to Kotkin written in June 1846. Marx, together with the other members of the committee, criticized illusions about the efficacy of petitions to authorities, arguing that they could only carry weight when there is a strong and well-organized communist party in Germany, both elements being currently lacking. Meanwhile, the Wuppertal communists should act Jesuitically and support bourgeois demands for freedom of the press, constitutional government, etc. Only later would specifically communist demands be possible. For the present it is necessary to support, in a single party, everything that helps the movement forward and not have any tiresome moral scruples about it. The founding of the Communist LAGUE, the most important result of the Correspondence Committee, was to create close ties between Marx and Engels and the London Communists, who at that time were the largest and best organized colony of German workers. Until the late 1830s, the most important center had been Paris, where exiled German artisans had started in 1836 the League of the Just, a secret society with code names and passwords, which itself derived from an earlier League of Outlaws. Its original object was to introduce into Germany the rights of man and the citizen, and very roughly half of its membership came from artisans and half from the professions. The League of the Just participated in the rising organized by Blanqui and Barbes in 1839, and on its failure the majority of its members fled to London, where they founded a flourishing branch. This in its turn created a front organization, the German Workers' Educational Union, which had almost 1,000 members by the end of 1847 and survived until the First World War. The League was led by a triumvirate of Karl Schopper, Heinrich Bauer, and Joseph Moll. Schopper was a veteran communist from Nassau, the son of a poor country pastor. As a forestry student, he had joined the Burschenschaft movement and had worked with both Buchner and Mazzini while Marx was still a schoolboy. According to one of his colleagues in the League, Schopper was a revolutionary more through enthusiasm than theoretical knowledge.
Bauer was a shoemaker. Moll was a Cologne watchmaker, intellectually and diplomatically the most gifted of the three.
The Union organized courses for evenings a week in the Red Lion public house near Piccadilly. A German economics professor, Bruno Hildebrand, has left an account of one of these evenings which is worth extensive quotation as it vividly conveys the atmosphere in which was born the Communist League, and also the German Workers' Educational Union, which remained peripheral to Marx's activities for many years. Hildebrand described an evening in April 1846, just at the time when Marx was beginning to establish regular contact with the London Communists. He wrote,